Right, so today we're going to be having a look at Clair Obscur Expedition 33, and before we start with the actual benchmarks, I just wanted to point a few things out here. The game only supports DLSS and XeSS upscaling. There's no FSR upscaling. There's also no frame generation, only XeSS frame generation, right? But right now, I'm just trying to show you that there's a difference between using XeSS and DLSS upscaling on the Nvidia GPU. So we have two sets of tests here. The first set of tests, we will be using DLSS on the Nvidia side and XeSS on the AMD side, because TSR just looks absolutely horrendous, and I strongly urge you to use XeSS if you've got an AMD GPU. And then the second set of tests would be XeSS used on both for apples to apples comparison, right? So here we are with the benchmarks, and here you can see that both of these GPUs are performing pretty much identical. They perform exactly the same here. The 9070 XT does use quite a bit more power, but I mean, this is just how it is this generation, and the 9070 XT uses a lot more power than the 5070 Ti for more or less the exact same results, but you can definitely improve that. I did make a short video earlier in The Last of Us Part 2, where if you use a frame rate cap or use undervolting, you can reduce the power usage of the 9070 XT quite considerably. But you can see at the end here, the 5070 Ti beats the 9070 XT by 1 frames per second on average, right? So really nothing, no big difference there. If we kick on DLSS or XeSS upscaling, I put the percentage there because XeSS, the name differs, right? So this would be DLSS quality, but it would be XeSS ultra quality, right? So I just put the percentage there for the resolution scaling. So 66% would be DLSS quality, right? And once again, you can see performance pretty much identical. At the end of the run, there's really nothing separating these two GPUs at all. It's just a shame that the game does not have FSR support. Now, you can use OptiScaler to get FSR 4 in the game as well, and you can also get a DLSS 4 by using DLSS Swapper and then NVIDIA Profile Inspector. I didn't do that because I only have a single test bench system, and it becomes a little bit of a nuisance to always swap files and make adjustments and then have to remove them for the next set of tests, etc, etc. But there are definitely a lot of videos out there that you can follow, guides out there that you can follow to show you how to do that. Now, yeah, we do have 1440p on the high preset, native resolution again, and really nothing at all separating these two GPUs. The game does perform quite a lot better than another Unreal Engine 5 game that recently shadow dropped. I'm not going to be naming any names here, but we can actually get away with native resolution in this game, right? If we kick on quality upscaling, well, quality DLSS, ultra quality XeSS, we are getting a high refresh rate experience here. It's without frame generation, so the input latency is perfectly fine, and I think this is pretty much where I'll be playing the game, about 120 frames per second upwards on 1440p using quality upscaling. DLSS looks perfectly good in this game, much better than TSR. That's why I tested XeSS, right? There's no reason to use TSR in this game whatsoever, especially in this specific spot. You see the little lights here in the foliage, like that just completely disappears with TSR. Now, I tested this specific spot. It's about an hour into the game. The previous area in the city is actually a little bit more demanding, but you spend, I don't know how much time you spend there, but I do expect you to spend a lot more time in this area here, right? So this is why I tested here. You might see results from other channels and it might differ because people test in different areas, right? It's just a matter of preference. Now, once again, yeah, on the medium preset, I just wanted to see what kind of gains we could get if we drop down to the medium preset over the high preset. The preset scaling is not too bad in this game, but you do get to a point where you start seeing diminishing returns. The same with upscaling. I see that using DLSS performance, for example, native has a lot less performance than the initial jump going from native to DLSS quality, for example. Not always, but it does happen. And now we come to the 4K benchmarks. Here we have a DLAA and XeSS Native, and neither of these two GPUs can get 60 frames per second here, although, I mean, it's pretty close, right? The average is 51, 52 frames per second here. At the end, they will be pretty much identical once again, and even the lows are pretty much the same, right? In the one run, the Nvidia GPU would have better lows, and in the next run, the AMD GPU would have better lows. And that's why it's better to use 3 runs or 5 runs and get the average to get absolute performance here. But because we do have run-to-run variance, right? And it is obvious to see if you do run the tests yourself, you'll see that the performance obviously changes from run to run. But this game is quite consistent in that, so no real issue there. Another thing, the game stutters very, very little for me so far. In the first area, there were a few traversal stutters only, no shader compilation stutters. There's not a dedicated shader compilation step at the start that you can see, but the first time you do start up the game, it does take quite a bit longer to start up than subsequent startups, so that means that there is definitely some shader compilation happening at the beginning of the game, but it doesn't show, right? And very little shader compilation stutter, if at all, in my 2 hours of playing so far. The game looks fantastic, actually. It's a very good looking game, but the story so far, I was planning on playing Oblivion first, and then I started making this video, and Oblivion is getting shelved. I'm going to be playing this. The story just so far is fantastic. Now if we use performance upscaling here at 4K on the Epic preset, we are getting around between 80 and 90 frames per second, right, which is pretty good. If you use the Optiscaler and implemented FSR frame generation here, you'd be getting 140 frames per second, which is actually pretty good at 4K, well, upscaled from 1080p, right? But even 1080p upscaled to 4K looks pretty good in this game, especially using DLSS or XeSS. TSR once again just looks horrible. Even native resolution TSR just looks terrible. Now if we drop this down to the high preset, we are able to maintain 60 frames per second at native resolution without any upscaling, obviously, and you can see we're getting between 70 and 80 frames per second on both here. Again, really not that big a difference between these two GPUs. The game does use ray tracing, right, for global illumination. I do believe it's software lumen. I cannot find confirmation of that, whether it's hardware or software lumen, but I do believe it's software lumen, because otherwise we would not be able to do 4K on the high preset native resolution 60 frames per second, right? Just based on previous experience on Unreal Engine 5 games. Alright, so if we then kick on quality upscaling once again, ultra quality for XeSS, it's really annoying that they changed the naming convention of that. We are getting between 80 and 90 frames per second again. This is actually pretty good for a 4K output. This would be upscaled from around 2560 by 1440p, right, or no, give or take a few pixels. Now I'm going to finish this run over here, and you'll actually see that the Nvidia GPU using these settings is actually quite a little bit ahead here for some reason, using DLSS quality versus XeSS ultra quality, same resolution scaling, right? But the Nvidia GPU is around 5-6 frames per second faster. Now we are going to start moving towards the XeSS benchmarks, where we have XeSS on both, and now you can actually see that the AMD GPU is going to start pulling ahead slightly. So there's definitely a slight performance benefit to using DLSS over XeSS on the Nvidia GPU. Unfortunately, there's nothing you can do on the AMD GPU except for using TSR or XeSS. But as I said, I'm going to keep on repeating this. TSR looks absolutely horrible in this game. I mean, it is part of Unreal Engine, right? It's always included in all Unreal Engine 5 games, basically. But there's no point in using it at all. Now, you can see at the end here, the results are pretty much the same, but once we start using upscaling here, you can, this is where the AMD GPU is going to start pulling ahead slightly. Once again, you're not going to notice this at all with your eyes. If you don't have an on-screen display with metrics enabled, you won't notice the difference between 96 frames per second and 100 frames per second, right? But it is technically a win here for the AMD GPU when both are using the exact same upscaler. It would have been very nice to test DLSS versus FSR. That's what I usually do in my other benchmark videos, is I try and test with settings that I know people will use, right? If you've got an RTX GPU, you're going to be using DLSS most of the time, or DLAA, right? You don't have to use upscaling. You can use DLSS Native, which is DLAA, and then you can use FSR upscaling or FSR AA as well if you've got an AMD GPU. With the FSR 4 being as good as it is lately, it's really a no-brainer, and DLSS 4 as well. Just use DLSS 4 and FSR 4 upscaling. It's really good. Now if we run at 1440p high XeSS Native, the AMD GPU once again pulls ahead by 3 or 4 frames per second here, which is slightly different to what we saw on the Epic preset, where both were pretty much identical. Now the AMD GPU is slightly ahead, but you're getting more or less the same experience, all right? Except the AMD GPU is quite a bit less when it comes to costing. I paid $1,000 for this 5070 Ti, and I paid $800 for the 907 XT. Both completely overpriced still, right? But if you can get them at their MSRP values of $750 versus $599, that's when it starts to become interesting, right? Is the DLSS feature set worth $150 to you? I mean, that's just a question you have to answer for yourself, right? But now you can see the AMD GPU once again when we start using XeSS Ultra Quality, which is 66% render resolution scale, which would be FSR or DLSS quality equivalent. The AMD GPU is about 6 frames per second ahead on average. If we drop this down to the medium preset, I once again just wanted to see the scaling. We are getting 110 frames per second on both, give or take, right? The lows fluctuate a little bit on both. Technically the AMD GPU is quite a bit ahead here on the 0.1% lows, but that does change, as I said, run to run, and that's why it's best to get averages here. But this does give you an indication of what the game will run like, right? Because you're not going to be running like I do 5 times in the exact same direction. You're just going to play in the game. And now you can see that here at the end of the run, the 0.1% lows, they averaged out. That's MSI Afterburner that I use. So don't compare MSI Afterburner lows with somebody that uses CapFrame X 1% lows. It is calculated differently. So CapFrame X will actually show a lower number than what MSI Afterburner does. Now, once again, if we go to 4K on the Epic preset here, both GPUs running native resolution here. Neither of them are getting 60 frames per second, although the AMD GPU gets a little bit closer. I got a little bit stuck there on the Nvidia GPU. Didn't see that rock there, even though this was the 20th time I ran past it. But in this specific spot, it drops into the high 40s on both. So not an ideal experience here. 60 frames per second, if that's what I'm targeting at least. So we have to start using some upscaling to try and achieve that. If we use XeSS Ultra Quality or Quality Equivalent, right, 66% render resolution scale, both these GPUs are just shy of 60 frames per second. You'll see now when we turn around and run the other way, it'll drop below 60 frames per second, although the average is pretty close to 60 frames per second on both here, and I wouldn't mind playing like this at all at 4K. The only issue is that if you are trying to hit 60 frames per second with a VSync lock of 60 Hz and it drops below that refresh rate, you might see a visual stutter, and that's going to happen here because we do drop below 60 frames per second. So your best bet is to just start using more aggressive upscaling. Balanced upscaling might be enough, but I did not really see that big scaling when dropping down to balanced. So in the video I'm just using performance upscaling here, and here you can see we are now getting around 80 frames per second, which I mean, if you want to lock it to 60 frames per second, you won't drop below 60 frames per second, at least in this area, right? I'm not sure if the game does become more demanding later on, but at least in this specific spot it seems to maintain the frame rate quite well. Now, last thing that I just want to mention here is I'm using the 576.15 driver on Nvidia, and then I'm using the optional 25.4.1 driver for AMD. It's the latest drivers for both the GPUs, and this benchmark was run on Windows 11. I had an issue trying to get the game to actually work. You have to enable the Steam overlay for the game to work, which is very, very strange. I always disable the Steam overlay, but the game just wouldn't start up. And eventually, SK Hijinks, a very good friend of mine, he managed to find a solution, and you have to enable the Steam overlay for the game to work. They did release a patch not long after, so that is fixed. Now, I'm not going to be talking for the rest of the video. There's only like 3 minutes left of the video, but I will be doing my outro, and I mean, there's nothing much left for me to say here. Alright, so just before the video ends, I tried the low preset here at 4K as well, but the difference between the medium and the low preset here at 4K is actually very minimal, so it probably be best to just stick to the medium preset, because the low preset does have a lot of pop in, especially in shadows and foliage, right? Alright, so basically, if you do have an Nvidia GPU, just use DLSS. If you've got an AMD GPU, use XeSS. There is a slight performance advantage if you start using DLSS on the Nvidia GPU, but as I mentioned multiple times, TSR is just not worth it. Alright, and that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.